Welcome to the Amagi class comment response. And, well, first of all, I'm going to hide this so we can do the top question. Crimson Sphinx. What happens if the treaty never comes in? Britain stays allied with Japan and Pearl Harbor still happens. Well, technically the treaty was a defensive alliance, which furthermore had the criteria of only being activated if power found themselves in a war against two or more powers. Which means whilst the USA might worry about the UK would probably just let them bash each other up and make sure no one else takes advantage of it. They would probably maneuver themselves so that they were key power after the war. They might join in, and it depends on the period. When you're talking about 1920s, the British are less likely potentially to join in and more likely on the American side. And let me explain that. Because the British joining on the American side would abandon the alliance, and they don't really like to do that. Also, that would be kind of kicking Japan while it's going to be down. But the British might well influence on the edges and ensure that it's a negotiated end with Japan not being occupied. But as time goes on, and it becomes more and more a case of if America pushes that far in against Japan, humbles Japan, America could well take over British position in the Far East in terms of dominance. The British are more likely to get involved because dominance is about perception to an extent. And if America achieves it on its own, they get all the credit. If Britain joins in, it's shared credit, whether America likes it or not. But yeah, that's one reason why it's multi-trigger, which is why the British don't join in the Russo-Japanese War. Because there isn't enough to trigger it. There aren't enough factors. If France had joined, then there would have been enough contenders and enough people involved for it to require the Royal Navy to get involved and Britain to get involved. But France didn't, so it didn't happen. Torpedo hole. The deep sigh in the midst of describing the main guns of the Yamato speaks volumes greater than the ship's displacement. Yeah. Canuckled. In your Japan-US war, having the UK arming Canada might just give the US extra force to deploy. Canadian reliance on the US markets and rising anti-Asian sentiment amongst Canadian voters and politicians would easily cancel out warm fuzzy feelings of the Empire. At the very least, Canada will sit the war out unless the UK ignore the statutes of Westminster, in which case most Canadians will be burning Union flags and calling to join US side of the war. Not sure how likely Australians would be keen to join the war, and enough war so soon after a Great War experience. Any British arrogance or entitlement could break up the Empire 30 years earlier. Well, Canuckle, there's two small problems with that. One, it suggests that the Empire broke up. The Empire changed to a Commonwealth, and that was a very different transition than the Empire breaking up. I do agree the Commonwealth is very different than the Empire, but empires breaking up don't tend to form mutual associations of friendship and prosperity and diplomacy and all sorts of things. They just don't tend to do that. It's a rather interesting scenario, the entire Commonwealth thing. But leaving that to one side, you have to remember there's the American war plans. The American war plans call for attacking British flagged and British Empire flagged trade in the Pacific, straight off any war scenario, and invading Canada. So it might not be a case. Canada might wish to be neutral, but before they get a chance, they might find themselves dealing with an American invasion. In which case, that's going to change the Canadian public opinion, because the British don't need to get involved then. And the British don't even need to start the war either. The one thing I didn't mention in the earlier sort of example is if the Anglo-Japanese alliance is still going on, there are some Americans who believe in preemptive action. So even though the British might not be going to get involved in the war and might be going to leave it completely, the Americans might well decide to do something stupid, i.e. widen the war. And you can sit there and go, well, the America should win this. They have their own content resources and all these things. You are right, they do. But the thing is, you could perhaps argue that the British Empire and Japan can't win it, but both sides can lose it. both sides can lose in such a war. That was often the reality which a lot of the cooler heads in both British and American governments at certain points pointed out. It was quite possible for both sides to lose from such a war. I.e., the damage inflicted to both of them would be so horrific that both of them would have a troubled time recovering from it. And it would be so divisive. The Anglosphere, as it's often termed, is an interesting problem for many people. You have a large number of interesting countries, some very powerful, all quite technologically advanced, who communicate primarily using let's put this way, sympathetic versions of a common language. Sympathetic by that means that they're largely still intelligible to each other. This is a problem. This is a potential issue, because it means those populations do a lot of intermixing and exchange. It is something which the internet has only made more true. It is also sometimes a problem in that you find, especially I would say on the internet, people translating issues across borders between the countries and presuming because something's one way in their country, in their version of the Anglosphere, it's the same in others. And it's perceived the same. It isn't. There's often a lot of differences. But the thing is, actually going to war with each other is going to be divisive. And the Americans, even in the 1920s and 30s, when they're talking about some of their plans to do with an invasion of Canada, expect to be greeted as liberators. Expect to be. And whilst in a scenario where Britain started the war and forced Canada in, ignoring the statutes of Westminster and all those things, I could see that potentially being the case. In a scenario where Britain hasn't done anything and America just chooses to invade on the potential that Britain might do something, that could be very, very different. Context and nuance are going to be key. Now, this was an interesting one because Darasaratsky said the Tosa has two funnels. The other one is inside the rear mast, built in front of supports. And for that scenario, well, I went and had a look at some pictures. I did. I went and looked at pictures, and that's tends to be what I do in these scenarios. I go and look at other pictures. I looked at this one and went, there's no other... this is a fairly good drawing of a Tosa. Is that structure? This? What? You think is a second funnel? Because that isn't a second stack. That's a stack. That's a support. And I looked at this one and went, okay. Battleship Tosa 1944 again, and again I was looking for a stack, and that isn't a stack. That's a stack. That's a funnel. That is just a structure, superstructure. So, came back to my response. This picture is better. You've basically gone, the only thing that separates them from the Amagi is the Amagi has more boilers below, less subdivision, Amagi's longer ship, and all these things. Picture is better. The Tosa only has one stack, no funnel inside the rear mast. As for difference to Amagi, yes, more subdivision, fewer boilers, more coverage of armour over a small and slightly fatter hull. Yeah. This is the point. There are differences between them. Those are the only differences. But those differences are quite major in terms of ship design. Ralph, is there information about the proposed purpose-built aircraft carriers that accompany these ships? I've wondered what the first generation of carriers would have looked like had the treaties not happened and the big converter ships weren't built. Not really, because most nations were still experimenting. The IJN had the Husher, And honestly, that would have been it for a while. It really would have been it for a while. And more importantly, their larger yards would have been pretty busy. So possibly cruiser hull-size carriers would have been their option if they'd been able to go for them. Gokbei, I imagine something like Soryu and Hiryu would come around eventually as IJN's first generation proper fleet carriers. I'm sure if it would be any earlier or perhaps later compared to real life, not really. If they're going ahead with their full 16 ships, those ships could be a long time coming. But probably about the same time, but it's going to depend on the cruiser-sized hull carriers and experience they get with them and how soon. Think about non-treaty 920s when the Japanese have built the Amagis. Does the RN bother with an N3, or do they instead opt for repeat G3s to provide themselves with a collection of more flexible resources? Even doing them as 18-inch arm, but keeping armour at G3 levels. This is an interesting scenario because A, you're presuming the Amagis are going to be completed and all in service before the N3s are actually under construction. And I doubt they would. I think the N3s would have been... the G3s 1920, 21 sort of... their ordering is October sort of 1921, almost 1922. My strong suspicion the N3s would have been about a year later, 1922, October 1922, maybe slipping into January 1923, but doubtful, because again, how the British tend to order and pay for the things. They'll start it, and construction drawings will be done in November, and then the plan will be to lay down vessels in January, February. So they'd probably been ordered in October 1922. And so they'd have been a year behind. They'll be roughly 2 years to build. Now, 2 years to build would mean that they would have been constructed and finished by about 1924. Here is the small issue we've got with the Japanese construction and the Japanese level. They had started in 1920. Okay, they'd started earlier. Amagi was laid down in December 1920, and Amagi and Nokosuka laid down on 16th December. They are expected to be completed by December and November 1923. Atago was laid down in November 1921 and was projected to be finished by December 1924. Tako was laid down in December 19th December 1921 and projected to be finished roughly December 1924, January 1925. In simple terms, the Royal Navy will be on the generation after the N3s when they're looking at the Amagis coming into service. They're not. They're going to be the G3s, N3s will be done. They'll be built. The British will then be looking at what everyone else is building and build what they feel is appropriate. The Royal Navy, as a habit, doesn't tend to build to what others are building. They build to what suits their needs, and then they make others conform to them. It's one of those things of setting themselves and acting as the benchmark navy. The benchmark navy doesn't respond to others. The benchmark navy strikes its own tune. Unofficially. Unofficially, it does respond to others, but how it responds will depend on what they consider as the best case. And also, the fact is, technology could change. The G3s are the level they're producing at that time, which fit the infrastructure they have around the Empire and what they have available. If they get better infrastructure, they might well change and build something better. Vision. Amagi-class battlecruiser and Tussar-class battleship looked pretty impressive. The clipper bow, big pagoda forward towmast, and towering mainmast. They do look pretty impressive. As a lover of big guns, I'm not going to lie, part of me is sad that the Amagis were never completed their original spec. Another part of me is also sad that Amagi herself, for no fault of her own, was victim of the Great Kanto earthquake. She'd have been so much more useful as a carrier than cargo was. Yes? No disrespect to cargo or crew, I would agree, but, yeah. Amagi would have been far better. Shrike, it would be utterly fascinating if you found definitive proof of the Plan H massaging core. We have proof of the plan. We have proof that H massaging core was planned. We have not enough details of what her plan was. We know it's roughly Queen Elizabeth class, but we also know it's a modified Queen Elizabeth class. How is it modified? That's the debate between me and Drac. Mr. T. Sclaro, what is the USN follow on to the South Dakota? I doubt it'd be the Tillman 3, but I can understand why Nancy is suggesting that. Don't think they actually got it. Bear in mind that the US government, if it was the US government that proposed the Washington Naval Treaty, because the post-Wilsonian administrations were not keen on paying to outbuild the Royal Navy. Soon before negotiations were taking place, the US Navy was cutting down on design team support. If Washington Naval Conference had failed, then the Navy would have finished the South Dakotas and Lexingtons before diverting considerable resources to new ship designs. Also mind, Tillman concepts did exist, albeit not taken very seriously, so those technically were options for further development. I think they might start off with some of the Tillman concepts, but there again, Tillman himself is gone, so that's going to depend on the politicians at the time, what they're pushing. Cody 85. I'm not good enough to write about what I think would happen if the treaties are delayed. Gogbane. Yeah, I would say SSBNs are the battleships of our time to a degree. So capital ships, whilst SSNs are more like cruisers. These are submarines are the ones continuing the World War I, World War II submarine role. I mean, all submarines with ballistic missile submarines, except to a degree, continue that role, but I think these attack submarines are the ones that fulfill it most closely. I can understand where it came from. Anyway, that's a very quick one. That is a very, very quick one. I will say I'm going to bat through a few of these, and then I'm going to go and look at a longer one I have, because yes, one of these videos has, well, there are a couple of longer ones, and it's whether I'm happy with them or whether I want to change them before they go live. That's a question. That's a question to think about. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care.